all the various things about it. So if you're interested in that, stick around till after the video, and I'd also love to know what you think in the comments. But with that said, enjoy the story. I went to visit my dad not long ago. We have a good relationship, we just don't talk all that much. His health is starting to decline. He was a little wistful. We're just each having a beer and not saying much when he says he has something he needs to tell me.
You're old enough. You may as well know.
I didn't know what he was talking about, so I asked.
Remember that time I got home from work real upset and wouldn't tell you what happened?
I did remember. It was something I would never forget. He wasn't just upset, he was scared of something. I'd never seen Dad scared in my life until then. He was the kind of guy whose bar fights were town legends. I also remember he told me never to ask him about it, so I never did. What he told me disturbed me profoundly. I've been bothered by it ever since. I hope that recording this will help me deal with it. First, a little backstory. First incident. When I was really young, like 4 or 5, my dad and I lived in a cheap apartment building on the ground floor. I don't remember much about it. I know I didn't like it there. The kids weren't nice to play with, they would steal my toys, and it was just a grimy area. But we were going through tough times, and it was what we could afford. Probably what I remember most about the place was how I would get woken up from my sleep every once in a while by flashing lights. I don't remember being too worried about it at first. I just assumed that there was lots of lights in that area. I was 5. I didn't know jack about meteorology. One night, my dad had my uncle and his wife over for a crab leg dinner. I remember it distinctly because it was the first time I'd ever eaten crab. While we were talking, I just casually mentioned the lightning last night. Dad said,
"There was no lightning last night."
I thought he was just clowning around, so I laughed and told him how the flashing lights woke me up. He and my uncle got serious. They asked me more questions about the lights. Nothing I recalled exactly, but they decided I was probably seeing headlights from cars driving by, shining on the curtains. I guess I believed them, but after that, I'd always get nervous when the flashing lights would wake me up, because I knew it wasn't lightning anymore. A few times I called for Dad when it happened, but when he got to my room, there was nothing to see. He started telling me it was all in my head. We moved out of that apartment after a year or so when Dad's handyman business picked up. The flashing stopped when he left, so I came to believe that it was a combination of passing cars and my imagination. It wasn't something I ever gave much thought to again until recently. Second incident. One time I was helping my dad out on a job. This was a bigger job, rebuilding a whole house, so he had a few other guys working with us. Some of them I knew, and some I'd never seen before. I was used to it. It's what he always did on bigger jobs. I was sitting off on my own, eating my lunch and listening to my CD Walkman. Dad generally didn't eat lunch, he'd just get too into work, so he was still busy on site. Suddenly, I noticed a guy walking towards me from the general direction of the site. I didn't remember seeing this guy before, but he was making a beeline straight for me. He was an older guy, his head was shaved, and he was wearing a Ramones t-shirt. He sat down beside me, way too close, and didn't say a word. I took off my headphones because I didn't want to be rude, and said hi. He told me my dad was looking for me and that I should head back as soon as I finished my sandwich. That was the plan anyway, but I said that was fine. To make things less awkward, I said I liked the Ramones. He didn't seem to know who they even were. After sitting with me for a few moments longer while I ate my sandwich uncomfortably, he got up and started walking away. I was relieved. I started to put the headphones back on when he stopped suddenly. I don't know why, but it freaked me out. I froze. He turned around and fixed me with the most hateful stare I'd ever seen. I didn't know what it was like to be hated until then. It was like he wanted me dead. I remember thinking what I should do if he attacked me, but he didn't attack. He just shouted.
"Someone's been sleeping in your bed, and I don't like it!"
Then he stalked off, leaving me puzzled and terrified. It was probably 85 degrees out, but I was shivering. I put the rest of my sandwich away and went back to work. I asked my dad who that guy was a little later. He said he had no idea who I was talking about. I described the guy, and Dad said nobody like that even worked on the site. At the time, I figured it was just some weird drunk, but now it has a whole new meaning. Things I didn't catch before stand out, like my sandwich was in my box when the guy talked to me. How had he known what I brought for lunch? Dad's story. When I was 15, Dad was called out on a job some house away on the other side of the bay. In the town I grew up, you have two sides. One side of the bay has all the beaches and the mall. The other side has downtown and lots of woods. The apartment was on the beachy side, so the house he was called to was a quarter of the way to the next town on the woodsy side. So he showed up in his van with all his tools. The front yard was really overgrown. No vehicles in the driveway, except a rusting husk of what used to be a 70s model Chevy. The house was in pretty bad shape, but he went up to the front door. Before he knocked, he saw a note telling him to come right in and they'd be back soon. He didn't like going into someone's house without them there, because he didn't want to be accused of anything. But he'd driven so far, so he went ahead. He got to work on repairing some of the wood rot around the window frames. He'd been there for nearly an hour when he thought he heard someone. He went to check, and there was still no cars in the driveway except for his van.
Hello?
He called. He heard what sounded like a door slam. Dad was not the kind of guy to get nervous. He was a local legend for his bar fights, like I said, but he told me he was starting to get creeped out, and that just pissed him off. So he started stomping around the house. He saw that the back door was open, leading into the overgrown backyard. He wondered if it was just the wind moving the door. He closed it and was going back into work when he decided just to look the place over, just in case. He looks around downstairs, and there's nothing to see. The house is in bad shape, but it's furnished. The place is fairly clean and tidy. The electricity still works. Someone's definitely living there, just not able to keep the place up. He's pretty much satisfied his concerns, but he goes upstairs to look around anyway. Upstairs is much the same as down, clean and tidy, just in need of repairs. Something doesn't feel right about the place. Dad's never been much of an intuitive kind of guy, so those must have been some bad vibes. The last room at the end of the upstairs hall is closed. It's the only door that was closed. It's jammed in the frame somehow, but he gets it open. It's just a bedroom, all painted yellow with yellow furniture. He spots some wood rot around the window frames upstairs too. He was told there'd only be 3 windows to do, and this one made 4, but he checks it out. When he does, the sill just lifts right up, and there are papers and things stuffed between the walls. He's seen it all. It doesn't surprise him. He pulls the papers out because he plans to go ahead and do this window too, because he's like that. He wouldn't ask for money. He just wanted the whole job done. When he pulls the papers out, he sees it's mostly photographs. Dad's big on privacy. He just happened to see the photographs, and he knew he was looking at something bad. He started flipping through them. They were all pretty much the same. The back of each picture is dated, but every one of them was a picture of a little boy sleeping. Dad recognized me in that ground floor bedroom right away. He remembered my stories about the flashing lights. It hadn't been in my head at all. Someone had been taking pictures of me sleeping for almost a year. He told me there weren't any pictures of other boys either. Whoever took the photos was only taking pictures of me. He called the police, of course. The listed owner for the house was an elderly couple living in Vancouver. They used it as a summer home, but hadn't been around to it in years. They didn't even notice they were still paying the electric bill. They had no idea about the pictures or hiring my dad. It was a dead end. I had so many questions after he told me this. For one, why would someone who was so far away from our apartment drive 30 minutes at night just to take pictures of me? How'd they even know me? How'd they fixate on that one apartment or kid, and why call my dad out to find the stash of pictures after a decade of leaving us alone? Dad actually had an answer to one of those questions. In a way, I find this creepier. Turns out he went to the wrong address. He wrote it down wrong. When the police checked his answering machine tapes for clues, he was actually called to a much closer home by a completely innocent guy. He stumbled on this house and stash of pictures completely by a random misunderstanding, so who left the note on the front door? I tried talking to my dad, but he wasn't in the mood. Shut it right down. I pressed him a little on the flashing lights, and he told me I should ask my Uncle Matt, so I did. Uncle Matt and my dad get along great. Never seen them fight in my life, but they're very different. Matt's easygoing, jokey, always has a kind word for everyone. That's why I was shocked when he actually got mad. He told me never to ask him about it again and to leave him alone. That would have been the end of it right there, but my bi-weekly phone call to my mom was due, and I didn't really have anything else to talk to her about. So I told her what Dad had told me, what I remembered, and what happened with Uncle Matt.
What the hell were you thinking?
She scolded, pretty typical of her.
He still feels it was his fault.
The hushed way she said it, like someone might overhear, chilled me. I didn't even know what she was talking about. There was some odd thing in my family that I kind of knew, but no one really talked about. This is the version of it my mom gave me. What Mom said. My dad and Uncle Matt had a younger sister named Flora. I never knew her as Aunt Flora because she was gone before I was born. When Flora was 8 or 9, weird things started happening to her. My dad only talked about them when he'd been drinking gin, Mom said. Gin made him brood. She used to hide his gin because it'd freak her out when he started talking about these things. Like this one time, my dad woke up because he heard noises in the kitchen. He came out to see what was up. Flora was making a peanut butter and sugar sandwich in the middle of the night. He had asked her what she was doing, because if their mom caught them in the kitchen at that hour, she'd have their butts reddened. Flora told him she had to make a sandwich and a picture for Mr. Chad Froy. Mom said Dad would shudder when he said that part of the story. His voice got real low when he said the name. So my dad got mad at Flora because he thought she was being dumb or half dreaming. When she showed him the picture she drew, it was a drawing of a boy sleeping with Matt written above it. My dad, being the oldest child, was very protective of Matt and Flora. He immediately felt that there was something wrong here. He took the picture and tore it up and told Flora she had to get back to bed right away. She told him Mr. Chad Froy would be mad because she promised him. Dad asked her who this person was and what he looked like because he meant to tell their mom. She said she didn't know what he looked like, but he talked to her from the drain in the bathroom sink. He told her all sorts of things, and she'd been talking to him every night for a month. At this point, my mom said she didn't want to talk about it anymore. It was giving her the willies. She didn't even like saying the name. Mom was always kind of superstitious about things. Like she would be afraid to say the name of certain diseases. She'd never say cancer, as if saying it causes it. She said just saying the name Chad Froy made her feel like she was being watched. But I asked her more questions and she kept going. She said Dad didn't believe Flora. She must have been dreaming or just imagined the whole thing. He took the sandwich and ate it himself after sending Flora back to bed, so his mom wouldn't find it. He remembered the sandwich well because peanut butter and sugar was not something they ever made in the household. He had no idea where she'd heard of it. He forgot all about what happened for a few days or weeks, until one night he woke up to pee and he could hear funny noises as he got near the bathroom. The light wasn't on, but Flora was in there alone. He stopped outside the door to listen. She was whispering the whole conversation in there. He'd figured she was half asleep and didn't know what she was doing. He went into the bathroom to get her. Then he heard it himself. There really was a voice coming from the drain. Mom said he would get a distant look when he talked about this and just set the gin down like he couldn't drink anymore. And my dad could always drink more. The voice he heard sounded cold and metallic, probably coming through the pipes, he figured, but it scared the crap out of him. What it was actually saying was even worse.
Come outside, Flora. Come outside. No one has to sleep out here.
Flora whispered into the sink that she couldn't because her brother might catch her, and the strange voice told her.
He shouldn't have eaten my sandwich.
Hearing it made my dad's hair stand on end. My mom said it was the most scared he'd ever been. Not one to freeze, my dad pulled Flora out of the bathroom and slammed the door. He warned her never to talk to Mr. Chaudfroy again because he was bad. He ended up telling my mom, and they found where the pipes had been messed with under the house. They had also found some drawings of my dad and Uncle Matt sleeping. They were all burned right away, and his mom forbade them to talk about it. They didn't handle scandals like that too well at the time, but my dad saw some of the drawings before they were burned, and they weren't drawn by Flora. I had never heard anything about any of this before. Dad and Uncle Matt almost never talked about Flora anyway, and when they did, it was always cryptic. I didn't know what this had to do with me, but my hand was shaking holding the phone. I thought she was done, but she said that was just the beginning. My mom usually gets tired of talking after 10 minutes or so. I was surprised. Maybe she needed to get it out of her system. She said that after that, Flora used to complain about flashing lights in her bedroom. Everyone just figured that she was seeing the light from the lighthouse because it was still active back then. She complained about it for nearly 2 years, saying she had trouble sleeping. Her mom got sick of it and put thicker curtains in her bedroom, and she kept complaining. She ended up getting her a sleeping mask. Problem solved. Not long after this, Dad, Matt, and Flora went to a friend's house to hang out because he had a record player and his parents would get him any records he wanted. They'd all just listen to music together. She left to go home before Dad and Matt did, but she never made it home. They never found her body. They never found her body. In theory, she could still be alive, but nobody really believes that. Mom thinks Dad and Uncle Matt always felt personally responsible for it, because if they'd just left with her, she might still be alive. My mom figures that's why the flashing lights thing upset Dad and Uncle Matt so much, and I guess I was opening old wounds by asking about it. At the same time, I find it really spooky that the same thing would happen to both me and Flora, and upsetting that it wasn't taken more seriously when it happened to me. I also felt really bad about hurting Uncle Matt. I visited him the next day to apologize. I told him my mom explained everything, and I really had no idea. He wasn't mad anymore. Actually, he apologized to me too, because he said I deserved to know. What Uncle Matt said. He said that there was a little bit more to it than my mom described. A week before she disappeared, Flora had started complaining about the flashing lights again. They figured she was forgetting to put on her mask, or it had been in her head the whole time. Then, a day or two before she disappeared, he couldn't remember, she woke up and the mask was gone. She couldn't find it anywhere. They figured she just didn't want to wear it anymore, but now he wasn't so sure. Another weird thing around the same time was that they found footprints in the snow outside of the house. It had snowed almost 3 feet overnight. Those footprints lead out of the woods behind the house and went straight to Flora's window. The thing Uncle Matt said creeped him out the most was that the footprints at the window didn't face the window. They faced back towards the woods, where there was nothing but trees. For the footprints not to have been covered in by snow, someone had to have walked to Flora's bedroom window sometime after midnight and stood there staring into the woods in a blizzard. Strangely, he said they never really worried about it much. Everyone knew everyone there. It just stands out in hindsight. The day she disappeared, they got a call from Timmy Jean, the boy with the records, telling them he got a new one. Uncle Matt said Timmy was only a child. He thought the records were how Timmy's parents got him off their hands and made him some friends. So he was normally really excited when he got a record to share. This day, he sounded flat, emotionless. Matt had to ask if he was even speaking to Timmy, and the whole time, Uncle Matt felt like someone else was listening in. He could hear a strange sound in the background that wasn't quite breathing. It was like someone saying, "yeah," really softly. Around this time, where Dad and Uncle Matt grew up, the phone lines were all what they called party lines. Each home's phone would have a different ring, so they knew who should answer. But anyone could answer or listen in on anyone else's phone call, so having someone else on the line wasn't unheard of, just impolite. They went to Timmy's, but when they arrived, Timmy said he didn't call them, and he didn't even have a new album. Uncle Matt and Dad decided to hang out with Timmy and listen to some of the old albums anyway, but Flora was really disappointed and wanted to go home. so she left alone. He remembered thinking it was too bad that she left, because they found her sleep mask in Timmy's room. That was the last time they ever saw her, Uncle Matt said. He was trying hard not to tear up. He said he remembered it like it was yesterday. Her little brown shoes, bows in her hair, and, he said, an oversized Ramones t-shirt they found during the trip in the city. It was her favorite band. I felt an awful pit in my stomach when he said that. I don't think I'd ever mentioned the details about the Ramones t-shirt before. Not that Uncle Matt would pull my leg on something like this. I guess it could have been a coincidence. A lot of people like the Ramones, but I'd never felt so unsettled in my life. I told him about the guy in the Ramones shirt. He told me just to drop it, because it was a long time ago. That was all he had to say. There was a lot of what Uncle Matt said that I find strange, like how unconcerned he seemed that Tommy hadn't made the phone call or the sleeping mask. I'm gonna be visiting my dad tomorrow for Thanksgiving. I'm going to bring 2 bottles of gin and see where the conversation goes. When I first unloaded the bottles of gin, Dad looked at me like I was setting a trap. In a way, I guess I was. I wonder if he knew what I was up to. I know at least he hadn't talked to Mom. They still hate each other. But Dad's a man's man and doesn't turn down a drink. I kept waiting for the opportunity to start asking questions, but it never felt right. It turns out I didn't have to. Dad asked me if Uncle Matt talked. I told him he had, but there was a lot that didn't make sense.
Get used to it,
was his answer. I was starting to get upset with all the secrecy. We'd always been a family of straight talkers, or that's how we thought of ourselves. I didn't see why this was suddenly changing, so I asked him why he wasn't more alarmed by the flashing lights in my room when the same thing happened to his little sister, or why he didn't immediately think I was in danger when he found those pictures of me. Why didn't he do anything? He told me he did more than I'll ever know, that I was typical of my video game generation, and to go ahead and have another drink, 'cause it's Thanksgiving. I did, but I wasn't feeling very thankful. After sitting in silence for a while, which is pretty typical for us actually, he said,
"Never liked that little rat."
I just waited for him to elaborate. Dad talks at his own pace.
"Timmy Jean, I mean,"
he said. I hadn't expected him to say anything about Timmy. He was about as peripheral to what happened as I could imagine, but Dad had a lot to say about him. About Timmy. Dad said Timmy wasn't really a bad kid. He was just strange and pale and weak. Most other kids didn't like him. His parents didn't even seem to like him. Even the kids who did like him didn't really like him. The general opinion was that Timmy's parents were always gone, although it was hard to tell whether they were home or not. They kept to themselves. Rumors went around that they were brother and sister. One thing that can be certain was that they'd inherited money. Unlike everyone else, they didn't keep any livestock. They just bought everything from the general store for Timmy and disappeared. Dad said today it'd be called neglect, but people watched out for each other back then. One thing that always struck Dad as peculiar was how when they wanted Timmy to do something other than listen to records, like go play Kick the Can, he'd say he was going to ask his parents. None of them had ever seen or heard his parents in the house, so they were surprised. But Timmy would go into this one room, close the door behind him, and they'd hear him talking to someone in there. He'd come out and tell them that he had to stay put. This happened a few times, he said. Not that they invited Timmy Jean out all that much. Another thing he didn't like about Timmy was he'd do strange things. Sometimes he seemed pretty normal, then he'd just change like that. This one time, they were listening to some new music he had. He turned it off and told them he'd learned a new song and dance. Dad wasn't interested, thinking it was childish, but Flora and Matt wanted to see. Timmy started walking backwards in circles, shaking like he was freezing, and making shrieking sounds. It was annoying the hell out of Dad, so he told Timmy to cut it out, but Timmy kept doing it. Dad had never seen Timmy show any emotion other than excitement over his records. When he was doing this dance, he looked downright hateful. Flora started crying, and Matt looked pretty scared too. Dad never had patience for stupidity. He grabbed Timmy by the shoulders, He said he remembered how Timmy felt. His skin was cold and jelly-like, and he could feel his small shoulder bones like they weren't covered at all. He shook Timmy until he stopped and was back to normal. Timmy started playing the record again like nothing had happened. Dad said they left because Flora was too upset. It was after this, Dad said, that he went to get Timmy for something. He couldn't remember what, and Timmy wasn't home. That was weird in itself, but Dad went inside to look for him just in case. He couldn't find him, so he decided he'd just ask Timmy's parents where he'd gone. He opened the door to the room Timmy always went into. The room was kept really dark. They could never see anything when Timmy slipped inside. Now, he knew why. It wasn't a bedroom at all. It was just a closet. There was a cushion thrown on the floor, some bread crusts, and a piece of paper. Dad said he'd seen enough. He closed the door and got out and never went back to Timmy's again, because when Timmy would go in that room, they wouldn't just hear Timmy talking. They'd heard someone talking to him. I'd already drank more gin than I should have, but this still sent shivers through me. But I thought of something. I asked Dad if this happened after Flora disappeared. He said no. So I said, how was it that he was at Timmy's the day Flora disappeared?
Your Uncle Matt doesn't always remember things right,
he said. He gave me a stern stare straight when he said this, like it was something I should keep in my mind to the end of my days. I know Dad's looks very well. About Uncle Matt. He said Matt came up to him that day and said that they had a call from Timmy to come over and listen to the new records. He'd heard the call come in, and that was nothing strange, but he never went with them to Timmy's. He went to the general store to pick up a present for Betty Coffin, a girl he fancied, and Matt and Flora went to Timmy's by themselves. When he was at the general store, he remembered being surprised to see Timmy in there, just picking up some food with a big wad of bills. He'd never seen that much money in one place in his whole life, so he wasn't likely to forget it. He told Timmy hello, but Timmy just paid for his food and walked out with his food and his bills. And Flora never came home from Timmy's that day.
That's all I know about it,
he said. I told him Uncle Matt said he was listening to music with him and Timmy when Flora left on her own. Who was he listening to music with then?
Wasn't Timmy,
was all Dad said. It was so eerily matter-of-fact. I took another shot of gin right there. I hoped it stopped me from shaking. When I looked at Dad, he was staring down with a sad resignation I'd never seen on him before. My dad could drink me under the table 10 times over, so after the last shot, he had to put me to bed on his couch. That was the end of our talk. Lying there on the couch, I suddenly remembered something from way back, when my family would go down to the beach. We'd all sit around the fire, the adults would drink and tell stories about growing up in that hamlet, and the kids would roast marshmallows and shiver listening to these stories. There were true stories and ghost stories all mixed together. These were the only occasions where I ever heard them talk about Flora before. After what my dad said, I remembered a story Uncle Matt told. He said he and Flora would go for these long walks in the woods together. My dad used to go with them since he was expected to watch them, but once he hit his teenage years, he got more interested in girls than babysitting. They decided to go back in the woods behind Hyman's general store. There are no trails or anything, they just pick a spot and went into the woods. You can go back for miles and miles into just pure woods. It's all national parkland today. Normally, they'd walk for about 30 minutes or an hour. Dad would always have them walk parallel to the edge of the woods. Without Dad, they just kept going deeper. They'd been walking into the woods for well over an hour, or at least he thinks it was. Flora wanted to turn back by this point, but Matt wanted to keep going deeper. She followed him because she was scared to go off alone, but she got upset and said she was going to go back on her own. He told her that that's fine and don't get lost. Uncle Matt said she wasn't gone 30 seconds when he felt her tugging at his arm. He got mad because he thought she was bugging him to go with her, but when he looked, she was pointing at something behind him. He said really seriously that he'd never forget how wide and scared her eyes were. He turned around and saw a man standing out in the woods. It scared him too. The man didn't really look scary. He was just a man, but there was no reason for anyone to be out so far in the woods. They shouldn't have even been there. The man had his back to them, looking deeper into the woods. He wasn't moving at all. They crouched down as quietly as they could to watch him, but he didn't do anything but stand there. Matt said he didn't like it one bit. He felt there was something really wrong about what was going on. He took Flora by the hand, something he never did, and they walked away, making as little sound as possible. He kept glancing behind his shoulder as they walked. After a few minutes, he was satisfied that they were well away from the man. He was long out of sight and probably hearing range. After a few minutes of walking, Matt heard a thudding sound. Flora squeezed his hand tighter, so he knew she heard it too, but they didn't say anything to each other. They were too scared. The thudding kept getting louder, then he heard this scream at the top of someone's lungs like they'd been hurt. Matt looked back and saw the man they'd seen earlier running right at them full speed through the woods, screaming the whole time, no words. Matt said he and Flora were so scared because they couldn't even run. They backed up against a tree and crouched down. Matt thought the man was going to kill them or hurt them, and he didn't know what to do about it. When the man caught up to them, he stopped short only a few feet. He took a deep breath and shouted in their faces.
Get out!
They were too scared to move, so the man kept shouting it at them.
Get out! Get out!
And they ran and ran back the way they came. When they were almost out, they heard Dad calling for them somewhere back in the woods. They were about to go running back to Dad so he'd protect them, but then they saw him at the tree line and ran to him. He took them home, and that was that. He said they never told their mom because they figured that they were just trespassing. After Uncle Matt finished his story, everyone was quiet for a good long time. The story seemed to bother Dad more than anyone else. I remember being especially upset by it, just because it bothered Dad. Then Dad said he remembered that when he first came to get them, he couldn't find them. He figured they'd just gone home, but he couldn't find them at home either. He looked in the general store and down on the fishing wharf, but they weren't there either. So he went back to the woods. Just as he got there, he saw them running out of the woods screaming and crying. He asked them what was going on, thinking that they'd seen a bear or something, and they just kept bawling. So he brought them home and questioned them to get the whole story. He said he never told Uncle Matt at the time, but he saw them coming out of the woods as soon as he got there. But he had never called out to them. I don't know why I suddenly remembered that story. It's just another weird thing that happened to my family. Just an hour away from where Dad grew up, in the nearest big town, there's a huge sanatorium up on a hill. It looks over the whole town. The guy in the woods could have just been some guy who got out of there, and they had the misfortune of startling him. It could be completely unrelated to everything else. So that gave me a lot to think about. I don't feel any more secure or confident after what Dad told me. If anything, I'm more confused and unsettled than before. The last several days have been a strange ride, but I know there's no way I can let it go now. I'll try to find out more, and I'll continue sharing what I can. I managed to find out more about Timmy. I had to hit up people I haven't spoken to in a long time, or barely know at all, but I eventually hit a few relatives who knew more than I ever expected to find out. Before I share what I learned about Timmy, though, I've been asked in the comments how I can keep such a level head while I keep uncovering these weird incidents. I guess it's because it's distant. I shake and shiver and feel dread when I'm hearing about or remembering these events, but it's still way back there. Even my dad finding the pictures in that house happened years ago. That's been changing lately. Little things have been happening that have been making me feel uneasy. For one, my mom has called me twice since Thanksgiving. I know this isn't overtly creepy, but we normally talk once every 2 weeks. On top of that, she hasn't been herself. She's been trailing off, going silent for long periods of time, and sometimes it's like there's an echo when she speaks. I started wondering if someone's tapping into our conversations, like with a baby monitor or something. And she's been saying strange things. For instance, after being quiet for a while, she said,
"It's lonely down here."
I asked her what she meant by down here, since she didn't live any farther south than me. She just said in a tone so flat that I could have been reading it,
"You should come. It's wonderful down below."
She changed the subject right after and seemed normal after that. My first instinct was to worry she was depressed or something, but I don't know. The last thing she said was if I hear anything strange about her, to not believe it. I've also been receiving other phone calls. They started a little before Thanksgiving. First call was an instant hang-up. The next time, just silence. Each time after that, I'd hear sounds. Cars going by, walking, wind blowing. The kind of sounds you'd hear from a butt dial. But they were distorted, almost like someone was imitating the sounds with their mouth. Last night it changed. There was a voice. The voice had a tinny, metallic sound, and that same echo as when Mom called. The combination made the voice sound inhuman and evil. The words weren't sinister at all, but the way they were said made it sound like I was in danger for the first time since I started this investigation. The first time, all he said was, "I'm on my way." I tried to answer "wrong number" back, but whoever it was had already hung up. I got a call a little later, and the same voice said, "I'll be there soon." This time, he didn't hang up right away, so I said he had the wrong number. A moment after I said this, he hung up. On the third call, he said, "I can see your house now," and again hung up immediately. I kept waiting for another call any minute, but after a few hours, I relaxed. I figured it really was a wrong number, and they figured it out. I mean, given the last 2 weeks, I had every reason to be a little jumpy. I get about halfway through an episode of Gotham on the DVR before the phone rang again. I don't say anything immediately, neither does he. After a minute or so, he says, "I'm right outside." As soon as he said that, I heard a noise at the front door. I don't know if I've ever been so scared in my life. I don't have any firearms, but I do have a machete, so I grabbed it and went to the front door. I opened it, ready for that hateful face from the building site, or worse, but my dad was there actually. He asked what the machete was for, and I asked him what brought him out to my house so late. It was a long drive, and Dad rarely visits. He got pretty irritated about that. He opened his flip phone and showed me a text apparently from me. In the text, I asked him to come out immediately. "It's an emergency," it said. I didn't send him that text. I didn't send him any text. I've never lied to Dad before, and that carries weight. He believed me. To be honest though, I was glad he was there at just that moment. We had a drink together, and he said he was going to get back home. I asked him a few questions about Timmy before he left. He didn't much want to talk about it, but this is what he said. After Flora disappeared, Dad and Matt were expressly forbidden to have anything to do with Timmy. For Dad, that suited him just fine. Dad nevertheless told his mom that Timmy couldn't have been responsible, since he'd just seen him at Hyman's General Store. His mom said there had always been something wrong with that boy, and she felt that if Flora hadn't gone to his home that day, then she'd still be alive. While Dad and Matt hoped she was still alive, their mom never really believed she was. She said she saw a dove fly into the house the day after Flora disappeared, but when she chased after it, she couldn't find it anywhere. Dad said it was just grief, and these kind of supernatural beliefs were common then. I tend to agree. Timmy made no effort to reach out to Dad or Matt either. He started keeping to himself after Flora disappeared. They'd sometimes see him by himself at Hyman's, buying lots of food, more than any one boy should require. They never talked. Suspicions about Timmy and concerns about his missing parents grew. The police had looked around Timmy's house a little, since it was where Flora was last seen, and found nothing, but now they were asked to search the house. They wouldn't say what was wrong or what they found in there. The rumor was Timmy's parents hadn't been there in a long time, and that the police had come out of the house pale and upset. But some towns always have rumors. Hard to say if they're true or false. Timmy was placed with some distant relatives in a larger town an hour away. They said he was strange and they didn't like him. He was always up and walking around at night. Sometimes he'd stop over the vents in the floor and just stare into them. After he'd been there for a little bit, they started to hear him talking to himself in the middle of the night. They'd come up to him to see what he was doing, and there was no one else around. They started watching him. They noticed he only did this when he was standing over the air vents. They even found him crouching down over one once. This girl, a third cousin of him, said it still creeped her out because she knew she heard someone answering him one night. Those vents couldn't have been more than 1.5 feet wide, she said, but she heard a man's voice coming up with the air. She couldn't make out what was being said, but she heard laughter that made her run and hide under her covers. She said she thinks part of it may have been a dream, but she always swore she saw a finger poking out from the vent too. She told her parents, but they said stop making up stories and that he'd been through a lot. Her sister said sometimes Tommy would walk out into the woods and just stand there, staring into them. They asked him why he did that. He said he was waiting to be taken. He went farther into the woods when she tried to talk to him more. One time, the girl said, she heard him talking into the air vents like the usual. She was tired and it was upsetting her, so she went to get her parents and have him sent to bed. On her way, she noticed Tommy was still sound asleep in his room. The talking had been coming up from the vent all on its own. They said Timmy would sometimes steal food from the house and take it into the woods. When he was caught, he said he had a treehouse, but they never saw if it existed. They'd sometimes wake up and find him staring at them in the middle of the night, and they'd had to start locking their doors. They would whine to their parents to send him away all the time, but they were careful not to do it when Timmy was around, because despite everything, they didn't want to be mean. One night, he asked them why they wanted him sent away. They couldn't figure out how he'd heard. He was living with them for nearly 6 months when something happened that changed him. They didn't know what it was, but he stopped all the weird behavior all at once. He wouldn't talk to anyone, he hardly ate, and then one day, he just ran away. He's been a missing person ever since. His parents never turned up to look for him. There was no evidence either way, so the case went nowhere. They also said, years later, when his house burned down, pictures of the fire appeared in the local newspaper. People talked about it for weeks because in the picture, the smoke looked just like the devil, horns and everything. They tried to find the newspaper in their closets, but neither of them could find it. I included that part not because I believed in a horned devil that manifests itself in smoke patterns. I think it's interesting that his cousins thought he was so creepy that the devil would be in the smoke particles coming off of his burning house. That's what I know about Timmy. He hasn't been seen or heard from since, from all I can find out. Same for his parents. Where his house was is just a lush field of rhododendrons. One last thing. After Dad left last night, I noticed my mailbox lid was up. I knew I'd closed it when I checked the mail earlier, so I looked inside. I found an envelope with a Polaroid photo inside. An old one, too. It was of me, Mom, and Dad all at the park together. This park is actually the same place where Dad grew up. The houses are mostly gone. Hyman's General Store is still there as a museum. I had to be only 4 or 5 in the picture. I don't even remember Mom going to the park with us. I wondered if Dad found it and stuck it in my mailbox, but Dad wouldn't bother to bring it to me if he'd found it. He wouldn't see the value in it. I kept looking at it, wondering what it was doing there. It took me a surprisingly long time to see it. In the background, in the thick Johnson grass, there was a man crouched down and watching us. He was barely visible. I couldn't discern his face or any expression in his eyes. I just had a vague but real feeling he meant to do us harm. I don't want to be too alarmist. The strange things happening to me may all have innocent explanations, and I'm just jumpy. I still want to get to the bottom of things, though. My investigations hit a bit of a dead end, but I'll keep you all posted. After my last update, I did something I haven't done since Mom left. I broke down. I called Mom up and told her everything that had been going on and how it's been affecting me. I told her I couldn't take it anymore. I have a regular life I should be leading. I have a job and friends, but I'm trapped in this maze of lies and secrets. Yes, I can be very dramatic. She said she would book a flight immediately, then we'd get with my dad and talk things over, all 3 of us. I told her she didn't have to do that. I know she's busy, plus she and Dad still hate each other. She told me she still loves Dad and always has. They just had too many differences. He couldn't accept her for who she was, but she always thought it was their destiny to be together. Her happiness in life was the hope that we'd all be a family, like we should be. I don't know if she was just saying this to make me feel better. It did make me feel better. It also felt weird hearing Mom talk like this. She was never the most emotional person. I thought that's why she was a good fit for Dad, because you have to be thick-skinned to be around him. She said she'd see me soon to put an end to this, and she said,
I hope your dad makes the right choice.
I wondered what she was referring to, but she was gone before I could ask. I called up Dad right away to let him know, because her flight couldn't take longer than 4 or 5 hours. She'd be arriving in time for dinner. As expected, this wasn't welcome news to him, but not for the reasons I expected. Turns out he's been getting reacquainted with Betty Coffin. I said that seems like a strange coincidence, but not at all. Telling the story reminded him of her.
Curves, son,
is how he described her. She'd sent him a message a while back telling him she'd gotten back into town. He'd just been too busy to write her back, and then he forgot. So happened they'd made dinner plans that evening. He'd be going to her place. Dad hadn't really bothered much with relationships after he and Mom divorced. He'd tried. Every so often he'd meet a woman he really liked and seemed to like him, well enough to introduce her to me. Something would always happen that scared them away. He used to joke that he was cursed. I think he probably internalized that. It was pretty much never his fault, though. Sonia accused him of calling her in the middle of the night and telling her weird things. I overheard the fight. One of the things was, you'd be so much better without bones, and that he'd kept calling her jellyfish. I know Dad wouldn't do that. He would never think of something so surreal in a million years, but she believed it was him. Andrea said she started noticing things in her house would move while she was asleep, and it only started when she started seeing Dad. Her CD collection in particular. She also said one night she woke up because she heard Dad get up and go to the kitchen. She looked out into the kitchen and saw him staring into the fridge. She started drifting back to sleep again when she heard more noise. The fridge door was still open, but she couldn't see him anymore. This got her mad, so she shouted for him to keep it down and close the fridge door. That's when Dad said, "What the hell is going on?" He was still lying in bed right beside her. She wouldn't have anything to do with him after that. Parker was my favorite of all Dad's girlfriends. She was a tomboy type. She loved camping, and she traveled a lot, so I'd heard all about different countries from her. She also talked about strange things happening while with Dad, like hearing him talk to her when he wasn't in the house, but she didn't let it get to her. They were together for a while. One night she had an accident while driving out into a remote stretch that leads into a dinky copper mining town nearby. She died a day later in the hospital from complications. It didn't seem important at the time, but now I remember Dad wondering why she'd been driving out that way anyway, and her sister yelling at Dad that he'd told Parker to meet him out there. There were other incidents. I probably don't know about them, but this is one. Back when I got Dad set up on ICQ in like 2000 or something, he started talking to this chick. She said he hit him up. He was a 2-finger typer, so I imagine it took a while to bang out messages. After he got interested enough to ask for pictures, she sent him a zip file full of them. All pictures of himself with a black silhouette, Microsoft painted into the shot. I traced the account as best I could, and it got to an address, the general store out in the national park. He just wanted to drop it, and we did. Anyway, with so much bad luck and love, I guess I was happy for him. He shouldn't be alone forever. It was just awful timing. I wondered if he was even putting her in danger by dating her, but I couldn't tell him that. I told him I'd deal with Mom, and he could have his date. While I waited around for Mom to call and let me know she'd arrived, I decided to search my house for holes, bedding, and such. I don't think that's paranoia at this point, but there were no holes under the bed, no nests in the closet. The plumbing seemed secure, and the vents blew air smoothly. Then I noticed the fridge didn't look straight. I actually thought I was being ridiculous, so I tried to distract myself. I ended up pulling it out anyway. I never believed anything would be there, but there it was, a little hole, just big enough for a child to squeeze into. I got a flashlight and my machete. I was so sure someone's hands would grab me the moment I put my head in. No one was in there, though. The space was only wide enough for a very slim man to stand very stiff, and I don't see any holes in the wall where he could look into the next room, my bedroom. He would have just been standing there staring into darkness behind my fridge. What would be the point? I kept wondering. Then I saw the doll. It was made out of twigs and had my face on it. Just looking at it made me uncomfortable. I refused to touch it. Call me superstitious, but it felt unnatural. I'd only made that discovery when I saw another doll behind it, bigger, and seeming to watch the smaller doll. Its face was a picture of someone who just looked evil. I don't know what evil should really look like. I just know this face made me feel like evil was there. I've learned my lesson. I immediately called the police and requested Detective Kirby. When he got on the line, before I had a chance to speak, he asked me if I was okay and if I was alone. I answered yes to both questions. As far as I know. But I wanted to know why. He said he'd been about to call me. He said that they'd gotten word from the police department in my mom's town. He hesitated. I figured they'd found someone broke into her house or a creepy letter. But what he had to say was worse than that. They'd found what they believed to be her body in a deep wooded area. It was remote. It was pure chance a camper found her. I assured him that whoever they found was not my mother. I had just spoken to her. She was on her way here. The line went silent. I insisted that I be allowed to make an identification so that they can drop this nonsense. Kirby said the body was past identifying. She'd been dead for over a year. Dental records confirmed it was her. The only identifiable thing was her Ramones t-shirt. I hung up on him. I had no idea how to process this information. If someone tells you the sky is brown and salt is sweet, do you accept it immediately? I had been speaking to my mom every 2 weeks for the last several years and never noticed a change in her behavior or personality until the last few days. If she was dead, who was I speaking to all this time? It had to be her. I know my own mother's voice, her mannerisms. She knew everything my mom should know. So I started to wonder about this Detective Kirby character. Maybe he wasn't on the level. He seemed to have a strange hold over my dad, calling him Francis. So I called up the police department in Mom's town. When I identified myself, I was immediately transferred to a detective. He told me the trace on the phone had come back. All calls from that phone were coming from my own town. Moreover, the phone is even registered to a local address. I felt an emptiness inside. I still feel it. It's only gotten worse. I didn't even have to ask about Detective Kirby anymore. I asked anyway, and it was confirmed. But I already knew. It couldn't have been my mother I've been talking to. She was dead. I needed to let Dad know right away. I tried calling him. It went straight to voicemail. I hoped this meant he was already with Betty and was safe. I decided to look up Betty Coffin so I could call her and reach him that way. I found her number with an online phone lookup. It was a landline. I called it just in case. Maybe someone in her household knew her cell number. A young-sounding woman answered the phone. She sounded a little overexcited to get a call, like she'd been waiting. I introduced myself and explained that I really need to get through to Betty and it was an emergency. She asked me if this was some kind of joke. I almost lost my temper, but then she explained that her mother had been missing for a week. I called Detective Kirby back. I told him he had to get to Dad's right away because he was in trouble. In as succinct a manner as possible, I told him what I knew. I was hyperventilating. I don't know how he understood half of it. I'm so glad he listened and believed me, though. I couldn't stand just waiting at home. I got in my car and rushed to Dad's. The lights were on when I arrived. That was a good sign, I thought. The front door was unlocked. When I walked in, I heard music. I recognized the song. It was Bobby Darin's Dream Lover. I'd never heard Dad listen to anything but country, but maybe he was trying to impress this girl. Maybe she came to his place instead. I called out for him, but he didn't answer. Dad's always had amazing hearing, even at his age. He could hear way better than me, and he was a great dad. I haven't always made him sound great, but he's my hero, you know? I knew something was wrong when he didn't answer. I searched everywhere downstairs. The damn song kept playing on a loop. It wasn't even coming from Dad's stereo. I went upstairs next. The song started over just as I got to the top. When I got to Dad's bedroom, I saw where the music was coming from. A record player was on his bed. I stared at it, not really comprehending why I was so afraid to go near it. I wasn't thinking straight, so it took me a long time to realize it, but the song couldn't be on loop. Someone had to be hand looping it. I backed into a corner involuntarily. I felt control of my bladder near slipping. I even screamed when I heard someone downstairs, but I heard them say police, and I almost cried with relief. That's when I noticed it. Something looking at me from under Dad's bed. The whole time it was watching me. All I saw was an eye at first, looking at me through a hole in Dad's box spring. I started to panic again. The officers, one was Detective Kirby, drew their guns. I pointed to the box spring as a hand reached out and set the needle back to the beginning of the song. They demanded the man get out. He started making awful sounds. I'd never heard anything like it. Cold chills swept over me like only once before. They finally dug him out. It was the man I'd seen at the building site, the weirdo that shouted at me. The same one that gave me chills before. He was wearing a dress and a wig with some smeared makeup and a bloodied nose. But it was the same man. I could barely stand to look at him, but he wouldn't stop staring at me. I asked where Dad was, and he said in my mother's voice,
"Giving birth to you was the happiest day of my life."
I felt nauseous. Then, in a perfectly normal voice, in the most reasonable yet most sinister tone I'd ever heard, he said,
"He made me so lonely. But you don't know. And I'll never say another word as long as I live."
They took him away, so fast it was like a dream. Detective Kirby took me with him. I was the last to go home and rest. Rest only came when I passed out, and while I slept, they found Dad. The address my mom's cell phone was registered to was the same house where Dad found the photos. Betty must have called him out there. He'd been stabbed in the neck multiple times. He's the toughest guy ever, so he was still alive when the police found him, but it was too much. He didn't make it. Loose ends. I really wanted to just drop this, crawl up in a ball and forget everything, but I have to put all the pieces together. What I have of them, anyway. I owe it to my mom, Dad, and myself, and to all of you for standing with me during this nightmare. After arresting that thing in my dad's house, police combed the old house, my house, my dad's. They found materials that helped them shed some light on the events I described in the previous updates. Scraps of paper, a journal of sorts, photographs, combined with additional information from the others who grew up with Dad. What I want to do here is give you each little piece of information. We've all had enough mystery. I want to give you the whole story, and by the whole story, I mean how I think it all fits together. It may not be 100% correct, but I wouldn't be sharing it if I didn't think it was pretty close. So let's start at the beginning. A schizophrenic was released from the sanatorium, really an asylum. He wandered the woods until he had some kind of episode back there. He came out in the little town of Grand Grieve. Chad Froy, since I have no other name for him. He went around convincing children to bring him food, like the peanut butter and sugar sandwiches. When he met Tommy, he even got a place to stay. Chad and Tommy skulked around together. He got sandwiches, and Timmy was interested in other things. In particular, the family that lived a few houses down. They were the only kids around that would hang out with him. He particularly liked Dad. Dad was handsome, tall, and athletic. He got Chad to ask Flora for more sandwiches. He wanted to see Dad and Matt sleeping. When Timmy's parents found he'd allowed a hobo to squat in their house, though, they got mad. They never beat Tommy, they just yelled at him. They tried to kick Chad out, so Chad and Timmy killed his parents. Police first found the bloodstains in the house and then the bodies beneath it. With his parents' camera, Timmy started snapping photos of Dad, Matt, and Flora while they slept. Flora noticed the light. She was just a light sleeper, apparently. This didn't stop Timmy. He kept taking pictures for over a year. Finally, one night, Flora caught him. She told him she'd tell her mom and that he was going to be in big trouble. The next day, Chad called them over to listen to records. I would guess at Timmy's request, but who knows. When Timmy was coming back from buying food, he saw Flora walking away from the house. He didn't want her to tell on him for taking the pictures, so he grabbed her and dragged her into the woods. He didn't kill her right away. In all the photos they found hidden in that house, there was one faded photo of a teen girl. It was Flora, I'm sure of it. In the photo, she was in some sort of cabin. She wasn't tied up, but she looked so unhappy. The whole cabin seemed tinged with unhappiness. It was an awful-looking place. She was 12 when she disappeared, so she was kept somewhere after her kidnapping, somewhere no one ever thought to look for her. Only Timmy and Chad knew where she was, probably where Chad hid while the police looked for him. After Timmy thought it was safe for Chad to come out, my dad was first in finding him and was involved in the man's murder. That much was confirmed for me by Detective Kirby. Timmy was already at his cousin's house by this time. He'd been taken as soon as his parents were found, so wherever Flora was kept, she was left alone once Chad died. While he was at his cousin's, I think Timmy had a psychotic break. Chad really was his whole world. He'd drawn Timmy into his illusions. He'd talked to what he thought was Chad in the vents and in the woods, but I don't think anyone was there. No fingers poked out of the vents, because if it wasn't all in Timmy's head, who was that? After some time with the cousins who didn't even like him, he ran away. He probably had money stashed somewhere, or maybe he just became a beggar. My dad, on the other hand, grew up and moved on. He met a beautiful gymnast and married her. That's where I come in. We were a reasonably happy family from what I understand, until something happened that made Mom and Dad resent each other. They divorced. Dad fought like hell for custody, and Mom went back west where she'd originally come from. Not long after Mom was out of the picture, I started seeing the flashing lights. When I told Dad and Uncle Matt, it terrified them. The possibility that I could end up disappearing like Flora is just about the only thing that could terrify my dad. What I never knew is that after I told them about the lights, they went out to the park together while I stayed with Uncle Matt's wife. They spent all day looking for the place they'd buried Chad, but they found it, and they dug him up to make sure he was really dead. That's why Dad was so insistent the lights were just in my head or passing cars, because the guy they believed was behind Flora's abduction was dead and buried. They had to believe it was him behind it, because if they didn't, they'd murdered an innocent man. Since this man probably murdered Timmy's parents, he wasn't that innocent, but they didn't know that. Years later, when Dad found the pictures of me in that house, he knew he'd been wrong. Whoever it was, he figured, was the same person taking pictures of Flora. They murdered the wrong person, and I was in danger. He went out looking for anyone suspicious, roughed up a few guys, but nothing came of it. What I think happened is that Timmy was still obsessed with Dad. He did something to sabotage Mom and Dad's marriage, then when
I'm a woman in my 30s who lives alone in a small house at the head of a quiet cul-de-sac in the UK. The street is a maze of roads away from the main road, which means that other than delivery guys and the occasional salesperson, you very rarely see anyone that you don't recognize. I don't exactly know all of my neighbors, but I do know what they look like, and I know where they live. I can recognize their cars, etc. Now, this weirdness happened over the space of a few months several years back. I work from home, so I'm usually in, and sometimes I don't have a lot to do. The first day was one of those lazy days. It was about 4 PM, and I'm sitting on the sofa watching some daft stuff about alien cover-ups or whatever. someone knocked on the door. I have a surveillance camera hidden in the wooden canopy above the front door, so I checked to see who it was because I wasn't expecting any deliveries and I couldn't be bothered to deal with a salesperson. It was a woman who looked late 40s to early 50s, very smartly dressed, like really expensive clothes and even jewelry. Stuff I could never afford, in fact. Most people around here generally couldn't afford it either. We're not an affluent area by any means, and this lady stuck out like a sore thumb. She looked flustered and agitated, glancing towards the back garden before trying to look through the tiny frosted glass window on the front door. I noticed that she was carrying a dog's lead, but I didn't see a dog. As it happens, at the far side of my back garden there are two hedges. There's the hedge that I own within my property boundaries, and there's a second hedge outside my boundary that's council-owned, along a sort of small grassland where people walk dogs. I know for a fact that there is a hole in the council-owned hedge, which I've reported it to council at least a dozen times over the past decade, and they've done the square root of sod all about it. Because of my hedge, though, I cannot reach it to do anything about it myself. Consequently, when I saw the dog's lead, I thought, oh no, I bet her dog has gone through that hole. If it's a big dog, it's not getting into my garden, but if it's a small dog, it might be able to work its way through, and I've always got some cooked meat, so I figured that I might be able to lure it out. I'm a dog lover at heart, so of course I want to help this woman if I can. When I was a kid, my dog went missing for a few weeks too, and I thought that I was never going to get him back. I was heartbroken for those weeks, but fortunately we did get him back, and ever since I've been extremely sensitive to pets in need. Anyway, I open the door and this woman gives me the weirdest look, like she was expecting someone completely different to answer the door and that I shouldn't be there. To be fair to her, my mum used to live here too, so I didn't think much of that weird look to begin with. Maybe she was expecting her. In any case, I say hello, and she sort of just stares at me for the longest 30 seconds before she tries to look past me and asks to see Margaret. I don't know what it is about other people's mistakes, but whenever someone has the wrong number, I always end up apologizing as if it's my fault. So that's what I did. I apologized and told her that there was no Margaret at this address. Again, she gives me that look, only this time there's anger behind it. Yes, there is, she insists. It occurs to me at this point that I have a relative called Margaret, but she lives about 60 miles away and I haven't seen her in years. Nevertheless, just in case she's got her addresses muddled, I ask, "Are you looking for Margaret?" and gave the surname. But she just hisses at me, "You know exactly who I'm looking for. What have you done with her?" I am absolutely lost at this point. I've lived here 20 years and I know the name of the previous owner, so I know that she's not asking for them. I also know the names of the neighbors and the names of the people who have lived on the street in the time that I've been here and since moved. And none of them are called Margaret. So all I can do is tell her that she's got the wrong address. "No, this is," and her name, and her address, "you're lying." That was a tad alarming. I mean, she's definitely at the right address. She's not knocked on the wrong door. However, she clearly thinks that I've done something to somebody who, to the best of my knowledge, has never lived here. I don't know how long the previous owner had this house, but we must be talking about at least 30 years since anyone called Margaret might have actually lived here. It's at this point that I notice that she subtly wrapped that dog lead around her now clenched fist, like she's planning to use it as a weapon. In my youth, I did plenty of self-defense training, so I'm not exactly scared of her as such, but I'm obviously getting a bit concerned about the situation that's brewing. I don't particularly wish to get involved in a brawl on my doorstep with a complete stranger after all. I'm torn between shutting the door in her face or trying to de-escalate the situation. In the end, I close the door a little so she's got less to aim at and tell her, "Look, I don't know who you're looking for, but if you think something's happened to your friend, then Maybe just call the police and let them sort it out. Sure enough, the woman slams her fist with the lead wrapped around it into my door. I later discovered too that she'd struck the door hard enough to crack the frosted glass window in the middle of it. She's bleeding from doing it. It must have hurt, but she doesn't flinch or show any sign of pain. What the heck, right? Any confidence that I had in my self-defense classes started to waver here a bit because I'm not used to people who don't feel pain. All I can think now is that she's on something and having a really bad trip. So at this point, I put on my scariest voice and tell her to get back. I let her know that I'm calling the police, and if she's still here and they get here, she can deal with them because I'm not dealing with her anymore. She then tries to stop me from closing the door, but I shove her back and manage to get it closed and locked. I make a point to stand next to the door while I'm calling 999 so she can hear me. While I'm waiting for the police to turn up, I watch her on surveillance feed. She moves out of shot multiple times, presumably to check the back of the house, and I hear her calling out for Margaret. A few minutes before the police finally turn up, I see her kick my wheelie bins in a rage, but then the most chilling thing happens. She walks back to the front door and literally stares directly into my camera. Now, that camera is pretty well hidden. I'm not saying that nobody could spot it, but most people would only know it was there if they'd been looking for it. Most people aren't looking for cameras, right? But she knew that it was there. She must have eyeballed it previously. When, I don't know. But I later reviewed all the footage I had from that day, and she never made eye contact with it once. She never even looked in that direction. I only had about a week's worth of footage before it. The oldest footage is overwritten, and I checked everything that I had, and she was only on the camera that day. All I can think is that maybe she had been here more than a week prior or something. While she's staring right into it, though, she flips me the finger and then makes a throat-cutting gesture before turning and walking off. I head to the window to watch her leave, and she's walking like she doesn't have a care in the world. She doesn't look back and just wanders away. Police finally show up. Good job I wasn't being murdered. Take a statement. I give them a copy of the surveillance footage, and that's that. I called a couple of times to follow up, but nothing. Nobody ever called me about it too. I won't lie too. This had me up for a few weeks. I moved the knife block closer to the door as well, though out of sight of any of the windows. I started staying up really late and not getting much sleep, which really didn't help. On some nights I was so tired that I started experiencing auditory hallucinations. I'd hear people who weren't there talking, and because this woman was the curse of all of my stress, I heard her voice and the name Margaret most of all. Every time I heard the gate open, it always put me on edge. I'd review the surveillance footage every day, and eventually, as the weeks passed and I hadn't heard anything else, I started to regain some of my comfort and just put it down to a really weird experience. But it didn't last. About 4, maybe 5 weeks perhaps, after the first encounter, she came back. It was just after midnight. I was in the living room mucking about on my phone with the TV on low volume for some background noise. I heard a car door slam and I peeked out the front window. A dark-colored car was parked at the end of my driveway. I couldn't see what make or model it was, but it looked like some sort of, I don't know, maybe estate car? I think Americans call them station wagons, right? I didn't see anyone moving about, but a minute or two later, the front gate swung open with its metallic groaning, and there was a knock on the door. Even when I'm not involved in a blood feud over imaginary Margarets, I'm not going to answer the door at that time. I check the surveillance camera. Its night vision mode is pretty bad, but I am positive it is that woman again. I can even see what I think is a dog lead as well. And of course, she knows I'm watching her because she looks at the camera again, and I tell you, When somebody is already giving you the heebie-jeebies like this, the way night vision makes people's eyes look like soulless black voids doesn't do much to make you feel better. Suddenly she yells out, "Shut that racket off and come out here now." I had the TV on, but as I mentioned, it was on a very low volume, which was so weird because, there's no way that she could have heard it from outside the front door. I couldn't even hear it if I walked into the hallway. I'm convinced at this point that she's mentally unwell, so I call the police again. I want them to stay on the line, but they just tell me that someone will be over soon and to call them back immediately if things escalate. So I'm waiting, watching, and just hoping that she doesn't start trying to smash a window or something. She kicks over my wheelie bins again. I don't know what she's got against them, but whatever. And yells something else out, which I couldn't quite make out, but whatever it was enough for one of the neighbors to come and investigate themselves. I watched the neighbor talking with her for a minute. She's remonstrating about something, wagging her finger towards my front door, but my neighbor is eventually able to get her to leave. He even sticks around for a bit to make sure that she's gone. Sadly, that also means that she's gone before the police turned up again, and made me feel like I was a bother to them. Another statement, handing over more security footage, more nothing. I caught up with the neighbor the next day, and he apologized because it didn't occur to him to make a note of the registration plate, but he told me that she'd said much the same thing as she said to me previously. She wanted to know where Margaret was and what I'd done with her. I'm grasping for answers at this point. Even if she is mentally unwell, the fact that she's sticking to this Margaret story and has the right address makes me think that there's something more to this than somebody having a breakdown. Then it clicks. Is Margaret her dog? Does she think that I've stolen her dog? Did she have a dog go through the hole in the back? Does she think that I've hurt her dog? Is that what this is all about? It'd be another few weeks before she came back. This time at 3 a.m, I'm awoken by knocking on the door. A few minutes later, I hear tapping on the bedroom window. I know that it's her instantly. I can hear her saying things, but I cannot really make them out because they're too muffled through the windows. It's like she didn't want to get the neighbor out again, so she's trying to keep quiet this time. I jump out of bed and put some clothes on as quickly as I can. I try and follow her as best as I can as she moves around the outside of the house from room to room, knocking, tapping, and muttering. I think that I hear a few coherent words like noise, racket. I'm pretty sure she called me some expletives as well, but maybe I was imagining that. I can't check the surveillance footage this time because she spray painted the lens. Not that it'd matter much this time. She's not lingering by the front door at all. I think about calling the police again, but honestly, it's just proven to be a waste of time so far, and I get the feeling that if I call them out a third time and she's gone, then they're just going to start accusing me of wasting their time, even if I do have the evidence. They've not exactly been that helpful so far, after all. In the end, I wait by the front door and listen to her. Eventually, she knocks again, and I call out, "Is Margaret your dog?" Dead silence. Nothing. I can't see anything through the frosted glass because it's too dark. I have no idea where she is, and I don't want to turn the outside lights on. To be honest, I don't even know why I feel this way. She knows that I'm in the house because I've called out to her, but I still don't want to draw any more attention to myself. I end up standing there for who knows how long, at least an hour, probably more because the sun starts coming up. My heart is going a mile a minute, pretty much the whole time. Once it's bright enough, I start checking through the windows to see if I can see her, but no, nothing. I tentatively open the front door and look outside. I still cannot see her. I grab something to arm myself with just in case. I can't remember what it was now, but I check all around my house and the back garden, but she's not there. As I'm heading back to the front door, I spot the oddest thing. The gate is closed. That gate is physically attached to the side of my house, and When it opens and closes, it makes a fair bit of noise. You'd immediately hear it if someone opened or closed it when you were standing next to the front door, but it's closed. So, what does that mean? Did she jump it somehow? It's possible, I guess, but I certainly wouldn't want to try it. Anyway, I open the gate and head out to the end of the driveway. I look around and there's no sign of anyone. I turn back to the house and I see that she spray-painted "Liar" on the front door of my house and left the dog lead on the floor beneath it. That was, thankfully, the last time that I ever heard from or saw this woman, but I think she still comes by sometimes. Ever since all this happened, I get this really creeped out feeling occasionally at night, and I always check out the window. I don't know whether I'm imagining it or what, but every now and again, I swear that I see a dark-colored estate car out on the street. Not parked at the end of my driveway these days, but I just can't shake the feeling that she's in there, watching my house. Perhaps she was looking for her dog, and she keeps thinking that she'll see me with it at some point. Whatever the case, this whole thing was strange, and it shook me. I'm still living with it, and I just wish that it never happened to begin with. There is a little hot springs nestled near the peak of the Pacimero Pass in central Idaho. Though it is hidden in plain sight, sitting quite literally on the shoulder of the road, it's not a well-known attraction outside of the valley. But the local ranchers are quite familiar with Barney Hot Springs. It's not unusual to drive by on the weekends and see several families enjoying the water. Barney Hot Springs, or simply Barney's, is incredibly remote, even for Idaho standards. It's at least an hour of driving over ruddy dirt roads to the small town of Salmon in the north. If you need a hospital, it's over 2 hours to the regional hospital in Idaho Falls to the south. To say that you're in the middle of nowhere at Barney's is an understatement. But the seclusion is one of Barney's major drawing points. That and the odd abundance of tropical fish swimming in the year-round warm waters. You can sit back, relax, and take in the surrounding views of the mighty Rocky Mountains with little in the way of distractions. But Barney's isn't all that it seems to be on the surface. You see, an event 40 years ago turned this little hot spring from a local retreat to a local nightmare. On the afternoon of October 27th, 2 truckers stopped for fuel at my parents' gas station and cafe in Howe, Idaho. They were hauling a load of hay or something over the Pacimero Pass, headed for a delivery point somewhere in Utah. As the truck fueled, the 2 men settled down at the cafe counter and ordered some coffees. Sipping his coffee, the old trucker struck up a conversation with my mother and the regulars in the cafe. He seemed a bit on edge, but was normal in comparison to his younger partner. That young man was clearly shaken, and didn't say more than a quiet "yes ma'am" or "no ma'am" to my mum. He kept his attention on the cup of coffee he cradled in his shaking hands. As the older trucker and the others conversed, he brought up a peculiar event that had happened to them that afternoon. So, they had crested the Pacimero Pass and were coming down into the Little Lost Valley. As they approached Barney Hot Springs, standing in the middle of the road was what looked to be a child. Bringing the truck to a stop, they soon realized in horror and fascination what was before them. It wasn't a child, but an odd, humanoid-looking creature. Its body was slim with long, slender limbs and a squat little torso. The head and the eyes were large and amphibian-like. It was not standing any taller than a preschooler. They could see its green skin shimmer in the brilliant midday sun. Dripping with water, it was clutching a large bundle of what could only be described as hundreds of eggs. The creature watched the truck come to a stop, then awkwardly walked over the rest of the road and down an embankment. It was obvious from the trail of water that it left behind that it had just come from Barney Hot Springs. On the other side of the road was a small stream hidden in dense willow bushes. No sooner had the creature disappeared, the two truckers were driving away as fast as their engine would take them. My mum and a few regulars at the cafe took in the man's story with silent, somber expressions and comforting head nods. This wasn't the first time strange things had happened and been witnessed in this little lost valley. Of course, a frogman carrying his brood certainly was the most unique story that they had heard in a long time. The regulars told the trucker not to get too worked up over the incident, as it could have been the autumn sun playing tricks on their eyes. The reassurance seemed to calm the men. They finished their coffees in a few quick gulps and headed out the door. My mother and the regulars had a good chuckle over the man's story and went on with their day. The following morning, on October 28th, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in Idaho struck the area. The Bora Peak earthquake was a magnitude 7.5 and could be felt hundreds of miles away. It destroyed farm infrastructure, roads, and bridges. It even killed 2 children on their way to school when a brick building in Challis, Idaho, collapsed on top of them. It was a horrific and frightening day for everyone in Idaho. Barney Hot Springs was not far from the quake's epicenter and did not escape its wrath. A couple passing visitors near the springs that morning watched in amazement as the water drained into the earth, leaving behind a stinky, mucky hole. Minutes later, to their further astonishment, the water came splashing back into the depression, but was now boiling hot. It was a truly bizarre geological event to see. The boiling stopped immediately after the earthquake ceased, and the water at Barney's quickly cooled. It's now more of a warm springs, having permanently lost about 15 degrees of temperature after the earthquake. The frogman has been seen a handful of times since that initial sighting, always near Barney's and almost always standing in the road. I personally like to think that the frogman was just a doting parent getting their babies out of harm's way before the earthquake struck and annihilated everything in the hot springs. Barney Hot Springs is still a widely popular spot for the locals. No one seems to be too bothered by the idea of sharing the water with a little odd amphibian man and his family. Someone even reintroduced the tropical fish after the boiling incident killed all of them. It remains just one of the many weird stories to come out of the Lost Rivers area of Idaho where I grew up. My friend was born in France, and her dad's side of the family is something like 17th in line for the throne or something. Basically, her dad's side of the family has historically been very high-class French people, and they have a lot of haunted stuff from pre-20th century France. One of these things is a dresser with a mirror. The family legend goes that in the 1800s, a girl died sitting at the dresser in front of that mirror. Fast forward to 2023, that dresser and mirror is in my friend's apartment. One night we had a party, and after everyone left at around 2 in the morning, she fell asleep on her bed and I tried to fall asleep on her couch. It was not quite pitch black yet. I felt safe, but for some reason I just couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it and just go to sleep. I closed my eyes and started to get tired. After a few moments of attempting to drift off to sleep, I suddenly got a terrible feeling in my gut that something was very wrong. I felt a presence standing next to the couch too. I really don't know how to describe this feeling too. I just knew that there was something there. I shut my eyes tighter, hoping maybe I was just being paranoid. And then something touched my foot. Something literally touched my foot. I felt pressure on the couch right next to my foot, and the blanket brushed against my foot in a way that could only suggest that something had hit or poked the blanket right next to it. It almost felt like someone was about to grab my feet, but got scared and chickened out at the last second. This wasn't some weird thing with the air conditioning or anything too. This felt very human and very solid. My eyes snapped open and I suddenly woke up. For a split second, I could still feel the pressure around my foot, so I know that it was a real sensation that I was feeling and not just some weird dream thing where you think something is happening in a dream, but when you wake up and don't feel it anymore, it's obvious. Plus, I didn't even fall asleep in the first place. I was just laying there with my eyes closed. At first, I honestly thought that maybe my friend had managed to get out of bed and walk past me so quietly that I didn't notice, but accidentally brushed up against my foot or something. But then I turned my head to where my feet were and I saw a humanoid shadow standing there, just right there, looming over me. Clear as day, too. Like I said, it wasn't quite pitch black in the room, but this thing, whatever it was absolutely null of any sort of light. When I saw it, my blood instantly ran cold, and I got that gut feeling that says, get out quickly. I blinked, looked away, but when I looked back, it was gone. I quickly turned around to check if my friend was out of bed, but she wasn't. In fact, she seemed to be fast asleep. I turned on my phone and used the light from the screen to investigate a little bit, but nothing. There was nothing lying on the couch around my foot. There was nothing around the room. So, what could I have possibly felt? I mean, there wasn't anything in that room that looked even vaguely like a human silhouette. So, what was that shadow and where did it come from? My instincts were screaming at me to leave, so I grabbed my bag, slipped on my shoes, and I just left. Somehow I felt safer walking around New York at 2:30 in the morning than I did inside of my friend's apartment. So, what do you guys think about any of this? I feel like it must be connected to the dresser and the mirror in some way, right? But the entity had such a dark energy. It didn't feel like it could have been the ghost that's supposedly attached to the dresser. If anyone has any idea about what I should do about all of this, then I would love to hear it. Should I talk to my friend? Should we do something about this? Please, do let me know. I'm currently dog-sitting for my grandparents, who live in a very rural part of upstate New York. They've got 3 Dobermans, who I love very much, and I pretty regularly stay over to help with the dogs when my grandparents are out, just so that they don't have to be kennelled and all that. My grandpa, he used to be a volunteer fireman, and he always had a police scanner turned on at all hours so that he could be ready if something happened. He hasn't helped with the fire brigade in years, but the scanner is still on in their house. I've gotten very used to the staticky noises that it makes, and tend to tune them out. Until last night. You see, I was standing in the kitchen next to the scanner while I was making dinner, and I suddenly became aware of the whispering coming from the scanner. I've been listening to this thing jabber for 21 years now, and I've never heard a whisper like this. But that's not really the part that freaks me out the most. My grandparents moved from an old farmhouse a couple of years ago. The farm was built about 200 years ago, and it was absolutely haunted. There was this one distinct sound that always happened when I was home alone in that house, and it was the sound of a couple arguing. When they moved into this new house, I never heard a thing. No footsteps, you arguing, no doors opening, nothing. Until last night when the whispering started, and I started hearing the arguing, just like the old house. It sounded like it was coming from outside in the driveway. There's a window above the sink in the kitchen that you can see the whole driveway from, and when I looked, there was nothing. Just some birds sitting under the feeder my grandparents have set out there. But then, the arguing seemed to escalate into screaming, and suddenly all the birds took off. I stepped out onto the back porch to let the dogs back inside and just stood there to see if I could hear the arguing from the front. It seemed to come out of the woods in front of me, so in the end I just went back inside and I locked the door. I really didn't know what to do, so I shut all of the curtains in the house and slept as far away from the driveway as possible with the dogs. Now, I tend not to get freaked out about bumps around the house, but being in a haunted house alone in the middle of a town is much different than out in the woods. I know the consequences of getting too comfortable out here, and it had me worried. I'm not really sure if this will have any kind of explanation. I guess I just wanted to share it here because it's just so strange, right? If you've listened this long, then thanks for hearing me out, and here's hoping that we don't have a repeat of that old haunted farmhouse. This happened a couple of years ago now. I, a 26-year-old female, was walking my dog Indy in my local field. It was dark, but it wasn't late. It was winter time in the UK, so maybe 6 p.m. The field is mainly used for rugby or football, but is completely free to walk through whenever. It's also surrounded by houses and streetlights on the roads, but the field itself is dark, so I had brought a torch with me, mainly so that I didn't tread into some dog poo. I've come in one entrance of the field, and I'm following a path that leads to another exit or entrance. I use the field to make a loop back around to the road and back to my house, giving my dog some off-lead time whilst in the field. Anyway, as I'm walking up the field, I notice a figure walk in the exit or entrance that I was going to use to leave. I keep my eye on this figure as they have very dark clothing on and their hood up. I'm shining my torch as I'm walking, so I know the person knows that I'm there as it's very obvious. And at first I wasn't really nervous, more so just being vigilant, I guess. Indy is a wonderful German Shepherd, so as you can imagine, I feel pretty safe with her anyway. It wasn't until I saw the person duck down behind a bush or a tree. There's lots of new trees and bushes planted sporadically up the part of the field that isn't used for sports, that I absolutely froze. I was about 200 feet from the exit, but would have to walk past that bush, the one that they hid behind, to get to it. I call Indy over and get her on the lead so that she's close. By this point, she is also hyper alert due to the person ducking behind the bush. She obviously noticed too. But with that, I hear a weird, sort of high-pitched voice that sounded like they were saying my dog's name. I assume they heard me call her. They said it maybe 3 or 4 times in this sort of longed-out, high-pitched voice. It clearly was coming from the person hiding. Luckily, Indy wasn't reacting to it, as it probably barely sounded like her name to her. It was then that I had a moment of shall I fight or flight. Either I, 1, run past the bush and try for the exit, 2, turn around and run back into the dark field and make for the other exit, a lot further away though, or 3, confront this guy. Indy at this point is hackles up, ears up and very alert in front of me, all whilst still maintaining a wonderful sense of calm. In the end, I went with number 3. I decided to confront this dude. I mustered up every bit of courage and confidence that I had, and shouted at the top of my lungs, "What are you doing?" The hooded man came out from the bush very quickly without saying anything, and I said the same thing again. "What are you doing? Trying to scare a young woman?" I'm so glad that my voice didn't shake or break when I said it, as I really was terrified at this point. He started to stutter and said, I thought that you were someone that I knew." I answered back and said, "Who hides from someone that they think that they know in a dark field?" After that, he apologized a couple of times and continued to skulk down the rest of the field, and I made for a swift exit within me. Who knows what his intentions actually were. I mean, maybe he thought that I had a smaller dog and was going to try to attack me. Maybe he saw Indy and realized no chance. Or maybe he really did think that I was someone that he knew. Whatever the case was, it was weird and really, really scary. On Friday, I left work at lunchtime to go for an overnight bushwalk to a remote campsite in a national park that is about 60 kilometers from my work in Canberra. I decided not to take a tent as I was planning to sleep in a hut that has a fireplace. It's still winter here. This hut is about 2 kilometers walk from many fire trails and can only be reached by walking along a narrow foot track that climbs up a hill for about 45 minutes. The hut only gets a handful of visitors each year due to how difficult it is to find and reach it. My car was the only one in the car park and I never passed anyone else on the way. There's only one track in and out of this place too. So when it got dark, I started a fire in the fireplace and had my dinner. I was tired and decided to go to sleep at around 8:30 p.m. as I planned to get up early to walk back to my car early in the morning. But at around 1 a.m. I woke up to the sound of a loud machine, really loud, like being directly under a helicopter or something. When I peered through the hut's window, I could see bright lights flashing around, lighting up the trees, but I couldn't see the source of where the lights was coming from, which made me think that they must be above me. There was no way that I was going outside to investigate, so I just sat on a camp chair, wondering what the heck was outside. After a few minutes, both the sound and the lights stopped suddenly, like they'd never been there. Now, there was nowhere for anything to land nearby as the hut is in a heavily treed area. After a few minutes, I got the courage to go outside with my head torch, and all I could see was that some grass, it had been slightly burned around the hut. Nothing else seems to have been damaged or disturbed, but I stayed up for the remainder of the night and left for my car just before daylight came. There's no way that a vehicle could get to the hut, and I don't think that search and rescue would have a helicopter up at night in such a remote area like that. Plus, there's really no Air Force bases nearby either. The national park doesn't allow hunters, so I really have no idea what it was or what was going on. Also, I don't drink or use any drugs, and I'm not on any medication that could alter my perception. I also don't have any mental health issues or anything. So, do you guys have any idea as to what this could have been? Has anyone else had a similar unexplained encounter like this, particularly around Canberra in Australia?